This set of videos will be a step-by-step guide to painting a portrait in oils. I'll start with the first lesson, which will be basically all about setting up materials, equipment, how to use a reference, preparing the surface, and just getting everything ready before we start actually painting. The second part of this tutorial will be the drawing stage. I'll be using my oil paint and brush to do this, and I'll be painting in a freehand style directly from the reference. There are various different ways of drawing a reference prior to painting, such as using a pencil or charcoal, for example, to make your marks, but also you may prefer to use a grid, a projector or a trace down method, and that's absolutely fine. The third lesson in this tutorial will be the colour mixing stage. I normally pre-mix a set of skin tones or values in advance, as I find this to be a good way to be more intuitive or spontaneous when I'm actually applying the paint. The fourth part of the tutorial will be starting to apply the colours. So it'll be the sort of early stages of blocking in the darker and mid-tones. And then the final stage will be those final details, well, not final details, the final stages, which will be the lighter highlights, the lighter areas of paint and the highlights, as well as all the sort of tweaks at the latest stage where you want to make sure that everything looks right. So that'll be the 5 lessons, and so we'll get started with talking about the equipment that I use. So for this portrait, I'll be painting on an art board, this is the brand that I use, but it's basically like a canvas board. But it's almost like cardboard. It's got a quite nice surface. You probably won't be able to see from here. It's got a slight texture, and it's ready to use with oil paints. It's specially made to do that. I'll be applying a light stain of burnt umber acrylic paint, and I'll show you how to do that in a while. The reason for doing that is that although it's not necessary, I just find that having some sort of ground there to almost like take away the white means that when you're applying the actual paint, it's not so glaring. You've got a mid-tone there already, so it just makes the painting process a little bit easier. Also, any highlights that you add to the portrait will really stand out. So if you've missed a bit of your surface, any sort of light areas will really stand out on that mid-tone surface. Okay. I'll be using oil paint, as explained. I use 2 different types of paint. For these tuition sessions and my sort of teaching, I often use a student quality oil paint. So this is a Winsor & Newton Winton brand. Any other brands are also available. I would recommend going for quite good quality rather than the cheapest you can find, because it does make a difference. The Winton brand, those student qualities, or any other student qualities, is perfectly fine. This is a Winsor & Newton artist quality paint, so I don't find the actual quality of paint too much different, but I do know that the light fastness and the pigment quality can vary quite a bit, so if you can afford it, then go for the artist quality paints. Okay, I'll be using a tear-off palette. I haven't got the cover for that one, but it's just, you can buy them in most shops. It's just this is about A3, maybe a bit smaller. The good thing about those is because I get through quite a lot of palettes, certainly with my teaching, you can use them and sort of it's easier to clean up at the end of the day. I'll be putting the paint out in a little while and I'll show you that process. Brushes, I actually prefer a synthetic brush, but I do also have hog's hair brushes as well. So these brushes are by Rosemary & Co, but lots of other brands are available. I prefer a sort of short, flat style of the actual brush head. It's a long handle brush, but it's a short, flat brush at the end. I find the synthetic brush is just a little bit sort of a bit more flexible, and you get a nice sharp edge with them, so that's why I like them. I do have a couple of short handled ones as well, but they're still short, flat. And also I have various different sizes. So this, for example, is a size 6, so slightly bigger. It's more like about 15 millimeters maybe. And then I have a tiny one here, which is a size 0. And I use that tiny one to almost do my drawing stage with, so you'll see that later. I do have some pointed round brushes as well, so if you prefer to use those for detailed areas, that's absolutely fine. I tend to use the short flat ones because I can get a nice detail with the flat edge or the pointed corner. But I will be providing a list of all the materials I use as part of this package. So mediums, a lot of people often worry about using mediums, but I find it quite simple to explain that I use a low odour thinners. It doesn't have to be low odour, but if you're in a fairly enclosed space, then a sort of a low odour version means it's not so smelly. A lot of people use Zest-It, which is a sort of environmentally friendly and nice smelling thinners, which I do recommend, but I just have this because I've had it for quite a long time. I don't get through much of it. And I also have White Spirit, so again, low odour version. You can get this just from any DIY store. The White Spirit I use for cleaning my brushes, so I have some of that in a jar like this, and that's literally for cleaning the brushes in between different colours. And then the thinners I put into either a little pot like this, a dipper, or into like a jar lid. I find these jar lids really useful because I don't use much, so I just put a small amount in the shallow part of that lid, and it means I don't use too much. I don't dip my whole brush in. So that's the mediums I'm explaining at the moment. I do occasionally use linseed oil, but I will probably go into that in a more advanced session because for beginners, just a thinners is fine. I have plenty of kitchen roll or rags ready to wipe my brush off at any given moment. And I think that's about it. So as you can see, I've put my colours out onto my palette. I have 9 colours in total. I do often use a limited palette or a Zorn palette, but this is sort of my standard go-to set of colours for doing a portrait. I have white at one end and burnt umber at the other end. So these are my sort of 2 extremes of light and dark. I have 2 yellows, lemon yellow, yellow ochre. I have 2 reds, a cadmium red and a permanent rose. And the permanent rose is quite a cool colour, so it's sort of, it's good for getting those slightly brighter, cooler colours in the shade. I have magenta, which is definitely not essential, but it's something I really like. It's a purple, which you can create using permanent rose and cerulean blue, but I like to have it just there on my palette. I have 2 blues, so that's cerulean blue and ultramarine, French ultramarine. They have different uses. The ultramarine is good for creating dark shadow tones. The cerulean blue I often use to almost neutralise some of the pinks and reds. A tiny bit of that can really be effective in that way. And then I've mentioned burnt umber, but that's my dark tone there. So I haven't got black on my palette today, although I have got nothing against it. It's just, especially for beginners, I would recommend not using a black because if it's on your palette, it's tempting to use it to darken a particular shade. So if you can avoid it, then just use burnt umber. Burnt umber and French ultramarine together, just on their own, would make a black anyway, or almost a black. Okay, they're all the colours, and then we'll start looking at the reference and setting up. This is the reference I've used, or I'm going to be using. It's a very simple and quite clear photograph of a young man. I've chosen it because it is quite straightforward. So in the process of drawing and painting, it's fairly straightforward. He's quite symmetrical, he's facing us full on. He's got some areas, or one part of his face in a slight shade, one part more lit up. And yeah, I think it'll be a fairly straightforward portrait to try and draw and paint. If you're painting a reference, then it's absolutely fine to use an iPad or a laptop or anything on a screen to refer to. I sometimes print mine out, but it's entirely up to you if you prefer to use a screen image. The only thing I would say is to make sure it's clear if you're printing it out, and big enough, so don't print out something tiny if you can't see it very clearly. This is actually an A4 sheet of paper, which is about 20 by 30 centimetres. So I'm now going to prepare the surface. It's, as I said earlier, it's an art board, which is basically like a card, but it's got a nice surface for using oil paint on. I use an acrylic paint to stain the surface, and because it's acrylic I need water. So all I'm going to do is put a small amount of acrylic paint in that corner, and I've got water and an old brush. This brush I use all the time for this purpose, so it's just one that you don't care about quite so much because it gets a bit ruined. And all I'm going to do is spread that paint around on the surface. You don't need to fully cover it, but just get it spread around as much as you can. I would be doing this if it was a canvas or a gesso board. It's the same principle really, it's just getting rid of the white basically. So once you spread it around with a brush as much as you think you can, then just use a bit of rag to just wipe it off again. So you're wiping it off to get that surface nice and even, and also to make sure it's not too dark a layer. I prefer just a sort of stain of the colour really. It doesn't matter if there's a few streaks, but I quite like to have it quite even. There you are. So that's that done. And you can see it's just a light stain ready to take that oil paint. It will normally take a few minutes really to dry. Because it's acrylic, it dries very quickly. But often I would do this the day before I'm going to be painting, just so it's ready in advance. So as well as using an oil painting art board, which I'll be using for this particular tutorial, I use lots of other different surfaces as well. So I often use an oil painting paper. And again, in terms of cost, it's just quite an affordable thing to do. This brand is Arches, but there's other brands available. And I often use an oil painting board. So these gesso panels have already been primed and ready to paint with an oil paint. These two are ones I've bought ready to use, but then I have a load of these MDF panels as well, so I'll buy these from a DIY store and then put my own gesso primer on. This is a white gesso primer that I'll apply to the surface. If you are going to use a panel like this, then make sure that you put a minimum of 2 coats on. So put 1 coat of the gesso primer on, let it dry, give it a light sand, and then put another coat on, minimum. I'd recommend actually 3 or 4 coats if you can do it. Then finally, the other surface I do use quite a lot are sort of fine cotton canvas. So a fine texture, not a rough texture. This is what I prefer. Some people really like a rougher texture, but I prefer a sort of finer surface. I find that it's for the technique of painting that I use, I like to have that sort of slightly smoother surface. So these ones I will list on my PDF that will be attached to this tutorial. I'm ready now to start the painting, drawing and painting process, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about setting up. So I talked about all the materials I use and the equipment. The only other bits of equipment I didn't mention was the easel. So I work fairly small, and for the purposes of this demonstration I'm using a table easel. I'd always recommend, where possible, using an easel as opposed to working flat. And when you've got your easel set up, if possible, make sure you've got your reference alongside your painting surface, so almost at the same angle. Because if your reference was lying flat, or even above it, above your surface, it would make a difference to how you see the reference. So where possible, make sure the reference is alongside your painting surface at the same angle and in the same eye line. So what you're going to be doing is constantly looking from your surface to your reference and back and forth. This applies whether you're looking at a photo or a sitter there in front of you. Make sure you're hardly moving your eyes to see that reference. So what I've got in front of me then is I've got my painting surface on my easel. I've got my reference taped onto another board that's at the same angle. I've got my palette with my colours on. I've got a set of brushes. I've got my thinners in a little pot. I've got my white spirit in a jar and some kitchen roll ready to wipe off when necessary. I think I'm ready to start drawing and painting. So on to lesson 2.